Hi everybody. Since we are unable to meet physically for the full moon meeting here at Andrew's home, we wanted to take an opportunity to talk about a few different topics. For those of you who may not be familiar, my name is Kirscha. I'm one of the founders of Five Sense Collective, and this is Andrew Beath. He is the author of the New Creation Story textbooks, as well as the founder of the EarthWays Foundation. I know your writing is focused on what you call conscious activism as a way to bring consciousness and intention to the way that we approach the earth. How do you think this coronavirus emergency is tying into your teachings in the textbooks?
Yeah, the coronavirus is an aspect of what I call the evolution of human consciousness. It's a way of us learning something from challenges and in this case, tragedy. We, as a species, are out of balance with our environmental circumstance, our condition, our ecological circumstance, our relationship to the living earth, the biosphere, all the living things on the living earth. So this pandemic is not specifically a direct result of environmental issues, but I'd like to look at it in relationship to the bigger picture of our environmental circumstance and potential tragedies to come. So first, let's recognize that this is a personal tragedy. There's some better news today that maybe it'll be less than 100,000 people in the US that die. But it's a tragedy nonetheless, and it's a tragedy for all those 100,000 people and for the families involved. What can we do? To panic or to be afraid is not going to help. So we can support each other, we can stay at home, we can follow directives that will help the circumstance solve, heal, and come to a new understanding of where we should be as a society. And that's relative to pandemics, it's relative to coronavirus, but it's also relative to our environmental situation.
In your view, are there other potential disasters waiting in the wings?
This is a trial run. It's a tragedy. The good news is that this is the first time I think so many countries have started to work together. Sharing supplies, sharing information, doing data research, trying to understand this issue so that we can solve it together. That's the good news, because that's going to be critical in the future. Yes, this is a premonition of things that could be a lot worse to come. What's going on? We've got drought, we've got climate change, that's the major issue, but it's causing drought, it's causing flooding, it's causing the disruption of food resources, it's causing sea rise, it's causing all kinds of difficulties. And that's just from an environmental perspective. From a human perspective, look at some of the other dangers that we've created. There are 8 billion of us, almost. And that's a lot of people. Now, we can live with 8 billion. 8 billion can survive together on the planet, but not with the values that we currently operate under. We need new behaviors as a society. We have all these nuclear weapons. They're crazy. Mutually assured destruction, mad. They're crazy. We've got to get rid of those. We have the potential for terrorism and dirty bombs that could be just as big a disaster as this one pandemic, for example. We have a lot of violence, and terrorism is causing disruption, refugee disruption, as is drought and flooding and other environmental hazards. So all these things combined mean that we are going to be faced with other emergencies, and soon. Now, we can learn from this and help to prepare for those emergencies, but the most important thing, and in my work, the thing that I emphasize, is that we need a change of perspective and understanding of who we are relative to the nature especially, and relative to all living things, and the living earth itself. So this is a step in the evolution of human consciousness, which I call the ecological epoch consciousness. Pandemics are part of that. 8 billion people, what that means is that there's very few wild places left. We've invaded all the wild places. Some of these pandemics are caused from viruses in nature that then, because of our invasion, because of our intrusion, because of our not being able or willing to leave wild places and wild beings alone, get transferred to us, and then we suffer these consequences that we're seeing now. So that's only one of many things. Look at Fukushima, for example, the meltdown of the nuclear reactor a few years ago in Japan. So it's not just one thing, it's one of 100 things that could go wrong. This is the first major one currently that we're seeing. Is it a direct result of climate change? Not exactly, but it's related. Everything is related. So what we want to do is see the earth as a sacred entity. And what we want to do for ourselves is find a spiritual way of being alive on the planet. And if we can do that, we will add meaning to our individual lives, and we will change our social values.
Now that we are in a lockdown, what are some not so obvious impacts that you see occurring?
Again, an opportunity to learn. Number one, I hear the birds singing more. Number two, everything is more calm. Number three, it's projected that there will be half as many automobile deaths. And automobile deaths in the U.S., range from 50 or 60,000 a year and higher, lower recently. But in addition, the regular flu, because of social distancing and because of being careful and taking care of each other, the regular flu will probably kill half as many people. Last year it was 40,000 in the U.S. That might go down to 20,000. So we're learning. Make no mistake, this is a tragedy for the people that are affected. It's a tragedy for the entire country. It's a tragedy for people who have lost their jobs and can't earn a living and are going to have to scramble to try to make that up and pay rent. It's a tragedy. But let's not lose the opportunity to learn something from the tragedy. We're creating a lot of disruption to the planet, and more each year, from burning fossil fuels, creating additional climate chaos, but also species extinction and habitat loss. So what's happening now that we're calmer, that we're not producing all these goods, that we don't have airplanes filling the sky, and we don't have cars filling the roads? What species are being harmed other than the human species is the question. And if it takes a slowdown of who we are as a species to help other species and other living things on the planet recover and heal, then we should take notice of that. If we're the only species getting damaged from the coronavirus and other species in some respects are benefiting, then what does that tell us?
What do you believe we can learn from this coronavirus tragedy?
I think the biggest lesson as it relates to the bigger picture, the evolution of human consciousness and our relation to the living earth and our relationship to each other and all living things, is that we seem to, as a species, as a culture, as a society, to be in denial until something hits us over the head like a club. And in this case, look at the reaction, especially our government's reaction and a corporate reaction to when this pandemic first appeared in China. It took us a couple of months before we were willing to admit, before we were willing to get out of denial, because we could no longer deny the disaster that was unfolding. Now, all through January and February, we had government officials and the president saying, "Don't worry, it's under control." Now, how's that analogous to the environmental situation, our climate change crisis? It's sort of the same thing. We're in denial of it, and it seems that we're going to go down that road until we're hit over the head in the same way this coronavirus has hit us over the head. It could be much worse, though. Certain things could occur that create a bigger issue than the one challenge than the one we're facing now. One that maybe can't be dealt with. This will be dealt with. This will pass. A lot of people will die. But are we going to gear up in the same way, business as usual, or are we going to learn something about potential future disasters? And most of those relate to climate change and what we're doing with the climate and our human density, and how we deal with each other, how we heal our social wounds, and how we heal the planetary wounds in the future. So the importance is, don't be in denial of the environmental circumstance, which could become much worse than the coronavirus circumstance in the very near future. Don't let the government continue to say, oh, everything's okay, we can solve the problems. Don't think that technology is going to solve the problems. Get ahead of the curve, start doing what we should have been doing for coronavirus. You know, we canceled some preventive programs just a few months ago before the pandemic started. And we had a lot of people, a lot of experts saying, hey, we're going to get a pandemic at some time that's going to be a big disaster. And at the same time, the government was in denial. Corporations weren't paying attention. And people didn't know. People were confused about the information, which is always the case. If you've got a president giving you false information, it's going to offset all the other experts that are saying something different. So we're in that situation with the environmental crisis right now. Don't allow government and business, who don't have an incentive to stop climate change. Corporations' incentive is bottom line profit. Now, for the most part, there are exceptions. Government's incentive is to stay in power and keep an economy humming so that they get reelected. And that's dangerous. Let's not let that happen now with the environmental crisis, because what is happening with the coronavirus crisis.
Do you have some concluding thoughts about our current situation?
Yes. What are our cultural values now, and how might they be different in ways that can help us address the coronavirus? Yes, and we're doing our best with the current worldview, but how can we change that worldview, advance our consciousness in a way that we can transition gracefully with minimal, there won't be minimal damage, there'll be major damage even if we transition gracefully into a new way of doing our economy, doing our education, doing all the systems, all the disciplines that we have need to be revamped into what I call ecologically consciousness, so that we can address the challenges that are coming. What are our values now? Our values are economic growth, patriotism and nationalism. Technology will save the day. What's our relationship now? What are our values relative to nature? That we see ourselves separate from nature, we're not part of nature. We see nature as a resource to be used for our benefit. And we think that we're superior to all the other species, all the other animals, all the millions of different species. We're superior. We're not superior. We're one of the many. And one of the many that has an ability to change the world, either for benefit or for detriment. And so our evolution of consciousness, our new perspective, our new worldview, our new attitude toward life and the sacred planet and a spiritual, meaningful existence is to find ways of living in appreciation and gratefulness for what we have and protecting what we have, changing the economy, changing the fossil fuel ways of creating an energy, becoming sustainable, becoming caring about each other, not being nationalistic and patriotic only, but looking at the whole globe, all the people, as we're doing now, as the coronavirus is teaching us to do, to try to solve it. So that there can be a benefit from this disaster. And that benefit might help us get through this very difficult period coming over the next 10 or 20 years.
Thank you everybody for tuning in. If you'd like to check out these textbooks, I'll place a link. And if you'd like to stay up to date with future events, please subscribe to the newsletter and we'll be sure to get you an invitation. Have a beautiful day. Thank you very much, Andrew.
Thank you, Kirscha.